Hello everyone, this is Professor Casey. Welcome back. Today we're discussing Chapter 12, adapted from David Emory Shi's America: A Narrative History. And here we're going to discuss some of the new waves of religion in the early 19th century in America. Okay, these are largely American-styled denominations of Christianity, some that have a few variances thereon. But we'll get into some discussions about the Second Great Awakening, which is occurring during this time period, and how the Enlightenment ends up influencing it all. So by this point in time, after the American Revolution has occurred, Enlightenment ideas begin to really permeate a lot of areas of American life, okay? And we've already seen discussions concerning philosophy and politics, the natural rights of humans, and now it's really beginning to affect religion quite a bit. Okay, and the three main components that end up filtering into new religious denominations, in varying degrees here, involve reason, moderation, and equality. Okay, we've finally gotten into the situation where, especially in the northern states in particular, now that slavery has begun to take root and gain a lot more traction in the South, the North is developing new religious denominations that are beginning to disavow the idea of social inequality. And evangelism becomes a big key feature in a lot of this as well. Okay, and evangelism also emerges in some regards as a bit of a foil to the Enlightenment in this regard. Okay, because the Enlightenment tends to focus more on the quiet, organized, reasonable, ritualized form of religion. Okay, and evangelism tends to go more into the louder, more emotionally ecstatic forms of religion at this point in time. But one key feature that does end up affecting both sides of this is democratization. Okay, we've already seen the emergence of America as the first real democratic republic anywhere in the world at this point. Okay, still most other countries in the world are, at this point at least, largely monarchist. And because we have the democratization of political life, we also start to see it filter into religion. Okay? And this is when the term manifest destiny first starts to creep in a little bit. Okay, the concept is there, although the term isn't really coined until a few years later. Okay, but the whole idea behind this is that the further west that Americans are able to expand, right, across the continent, this is something that we are being given by a divine ordination, right, by some kind of divine being, in this case, the Christian God in most people's minds, okay? And this is done in order to create an ideal society, okay, that somehow we are going to get the chance to start over out west, right? Any kind of political corruption or social corruption that we see taking place in the east can potentially be filtered out the further west that we go. And the whole idea here, too, is that if we create an ideal society, we have to have ideal citizens to live in it. Okay, and so herein comes the element of social reform. And the 19th century is really when we start to see social reform taking root quite heavily in American society. Okay, it starts to filter in not only to religion, but also to politics, to sociology, to the development of medicine, and all kinds of things. And we have social activism specifically through reform, okay? And this ends up leading to a lot of human rights advances, okay? So it doesn't just affect people in the religious sphere, right? If they are largely non-religious, it still ends up having this ripple effect. And ideas like predestination, which we've already talked a little bit about concerning Calvinism, it's the idea that God has already chosen who is going to go to heaven when they die. This ends up becoming outmoded. Okay, people start to realize that this seems a little bit too dictatorial, right? That people are not really given a choice as to whether they are going to receive eternal damnation or receive eternal salvation. And there becomes an increasing interest in the idea of deism. Okay, this is the what is sometimes referred to as the watchmaker scenario. Okay, the idea that was held by many of the founding fathers. Okay, and what this essentially amounts to, and just as a refresher here, is the idea that the universe and all of its wonders were created by some sort of divine being. In this case, we typically refer to this as the Christian God, right? A male patriarchal deity. Okay. And the idea here is that God has created all of the universe, all the planets, all the animals, the plants, human beings, etc., set all of the natural laws in motion after they've been written, has essentially wound up the clock, and then has stepped away from it all, and is simply waiting for the clock to run out. Okay? And what this ends up filtering down to in this particular present day is that people now have the ability to understand the natural laws of the universe. Okay? If we study science hard enough, if we study nature hard enough, we might be able to tap into what was going through God's mind. Okay? It also involves a large rejection of the literal interpretation of the Bible. Okay, this is what is the alternative of this is called fundamentalism, right? The idea that all of the events that occur in the Bible were to be taken as literal fact. Okay, from everything from the Garden of Eden, the flood, all these major events that end up occurring throughout biblical history are not to be taken as fact in deism. Okay? And it also goes all the way to questioning the divinity of Jesus, because if God has set the universe in motion from the very beginning and has chosen not to intervene since, then the figure of Jesus represents a bit of a foil to that. Okay, because if Jesus has come to earth as a representative of God, right, then that counts as God somehow intervening. Okay, and so deists largely begin to look at Jesus as perhaps being something of a prophet, or being, if nothing else, just a good human being, right? Thomas Jefferson in particular takes this so far as to write his own version of the Bible that we refer to as the Jefferson Bible. Okay, this is where he actually goes through the New Testament and begins to actually edit out the parts that suggest that Jesus is a divine being. Okay, in many people's eyes, especially in today, this could be considered blasphemous. Okay, but this was something of a social experiment at the time. And finally, and perhaps one of the more discouraging aspects of deism, is the idea that prayer itself is largely ineffective. Okay, because if God has chosen not to intervene, if he has essentially disappeared, right, he's not hanging up his shingle anymore, so to speak, then there's no point in praying to him. So this is it's a lot of difficult concepts for a modern audience to imagine, because when it comes to 21st century Christianity especially, people tend to go toward a theistic ideology, right? The idea that God constantly intervenes, right? Sends messages, and answers prayers, heals people, etc. Okay, so this is a large departure from what we end up seeing in the modern day. Now, two other denominations that emerged during this period in time that are foils to what has gone on before in terms of the emotional aspect of religion and the more rigorous and stringent forms of Christianity are Unitarianism and Universalism. Okay? Unitarianism is particularly a foil to Puritanism. Okay? Puritanism, again, is what we typically associate with the Pilgrims. Okay? This was the group that ended up persecuting individuals during the Salem witch trials, right? They're very, very suspicious of anyone who is not a part of their community, who doesn't follow their particular patriarchal rules. They are, very suspicious of demonic possession, of the darkness in humanity. Okay, they take a very pessimistic view of humanity in general and of other religious denominations. Okay, Unitarianism, though, ends up becoming very popular in the upper echelon of society in Boston, in particular. Okay, especially among people who are highly educated. Okay? And it becomes something of a liberal faith, right? Something where people are not so much concerned about outsiders or concerned about outside ideas, but are more interested in actually studying them and trying to understand them in comparison with their own beliefs. Okay, and the emphasis here is on the unity, quote unquote, hence Unitarianism, and compassion of God. Okay, and this again is another area that is controversial, again, in respect to modern Christianity, especially in many cases, because Unitarianism says that there is no Trinity. Okay? In many Christian denominations, the idea of the Trinity claims that God is actually separated into three distinct iterations or beings that are all comprised into one larger deity. Okay? And the idea of the Trinity here says that there is a God, the Father, God as the Son in the form of Jesus, and God in the form of the Holy Spirit, right? Some form of protection, inspiration, divine messenger, that sort of thing. Okay, but what Unitarianism says here is there is no distinction among these three beings, right? God is God, and that's that. Okay? And Unitarianism also says that humanity is naturally good, okay, and everyone is worthy of salvation, okay. So this completely does away with, again, this idea of predestination that we've seen with Calvinism. It does away with the idea of original sin as well. Okay, many Christian denominations, even today, still preach the idea that from the very beginning of humanity, if we take a fundamentalist view, right, if we go back to the idea of the Garden of Eden, humanity has essentially been cursed or tainted by disobeying God from the very beginning. Okay, and the only way to remove that stain from our souls, so to speak, is to actually choose salvation, right? To actually give our lives, our spirits, etc., over to the kingdom of God in the form of Jesus. Okay, so in other words, the New Testament ends up kind of eclipsing in many ways the curses of the Old Testament in that regard. But Unitarians say there is no such thing as original sin. Okay? We are all naturally good. There is no reason to be down on ourselves and say that we are worthless human beings by having this stain, okay? Because they believe it doesn't exist. And Unitarians also are much more into the calm ritual aspect of religion. Okay, it's more of a therapeutic presence than a stressful one. Okay, so it's not so much of an emotional worship service that you would see if you went to a Unitarian church today. Again, it's much more of a calm presentation of beliefs and in some cases a discourse. And again, complete rejection of the idea of predestination, okay, that we're going to democratize Christianity as much as possible and do away with this idea of a dictatorial God. And again, the Bible is not to be taken as literal in this case. Okay, it rejects fundamentalism in its entirety. Okay, we're not to believe necessarily that there was a large deluge or flood that ends up destroying all life on the earth except for a giant wooden ship with humans and animals inside. And it's supposed to be taken as metaphor in most cases. And there are still religious denominations today that struggle back and forth with these ideas, right? Whether to take the Bible as literal or to take it as metaphor. And the other aspect of this that ends up kind of morphing a little bit out of Unitarianism, although it's designated more for a different social class, is universalism. Okay, much of the same ideas occur in universalism as in Unitarianism, but with a slightly different slant. Okay, universalism in particular appeals more to the working class. Okay, because this is the time period where industrialization has bred a new form of the working poor. Okay, individuals who are struggling in factories, who really don't have much of a positive outlook on life, right? They struggle to feed themselves and their families, and so religion has to provide for them some form of comfort in all this. And it emphasizes more than anything else dignity and worthiness, okay? Because these are two big things that members of the working class at this point may be lacking in. Okay, you may be an individual who is either native born or an immigrant who works in a factory for 15, 16 hours a day, comes home, you may have lost fingers or limbs or something along those lines, and your factory owner might not really think that you are a worthy individual. Okay, but in universalism, God and all of your congregational members think that you are worthy. Okay, and it believes that people ought to be liberated from any kind of rule of priests and or ministers. Okay, so it's a very, very loose structure in universalism. Removes the pressures of pleasing someone who might be allegedly in charge of you in a religious aspect. Okay, you're not out to ask for forgiveness much for anything, and you're not out to really fulfill certain rules either. And it emphasizes, too, the use of an individual's personal faculties to be able to explore the mysteries of the universe. Okay, so in other words, you have the right to read whatever you want, to figure out how God or the divine ends up impacting your life. And universalism also doesn't necessarily take the traditional Christian viewpoint when it comes to a patriarchal God. Okay, you might look at God as being male or female, right? It may God may even take a neutral form, neither male nor female. Okay, you may be monotheistic, you might be polytheistic, you might be pantheistic. Okay, there's all kinds of forms that the divine is allowed to take within the very loose confines of universalism. And one major aspect of this too that Unitarianism doesn't necessarily espouse, right, even though it's kind of unspoken, is that the idea that hell does not exist. Okay, that universal damnation is not really a fact. Okay, that salvation itself becomes universal, hence universalism. So, to boil it down here, Universalists believe that God is essentially too good to damn anyone for eternity, and Unitarians believe that humans are too good to be damned. Okay, so it's a largely a combination of the ideas of humans being naturally good, of us, we should be able to respect one another and not be so concerned about what awaits us in the afterlife. Okay, and again, this ends up being a bit of a foil to what we start to see emerge during the Second Great Awakening with a lot of evangelical forms of Christianity. Now, when it comes to other religions that have been in existence in the United States from its inception, for one thing, Anglicanism ends up going on the decline after the American Revolution, specifically because it is literally the Church of England, right, the side that we fought against during the Revolution. And so Anglicanism begins to gradually morph into a new form of religious denomination called the Episcopalian Church. Okay? And if you attend an Anglican church today versus an Episcopalian church service, they're very, very similar. Okay? They have a lot of the same decorations and vestments and processions and rituals and so forth. The primary difference between the two, at least in the 21st century, is that the Anglican Church tends to be the more conservative of the two. Okay, the Episcopalian Church has since allowed women to become ministers, has allowed gay and lesbian ministers to come to the forefront. It's changed a lot of the traditional aspects of Anglicanism, okay? Although both do still exist here in the United States. The other two denominations that become more and more popular at this time are the Baptist Church and the Methodist Church. Okay, and both of these are primarily popular in the South. Okay, they again have this democratic nature associated with them. There's very little hierarchy except for perhaps a few church deacons and a minister. And the minister is typically subject to the will of the church deacons. Okay, the deacons can choose to appoint or remove a minister if they agree or disagree with what he has to say. And the Methodist Church is born in the mind of John Wesley in 1784. He actually breaks away from the Episcopal Church and begins to adapt it with the idea of universal conversion, right? The idea that it is taken from a New Testament scripture given by Jesus to his apostles, saying, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel." Right. So it's the idea that everyone eventually is going to end up at some point being converted to not necessarily this particular form of Christianity, but to Christianity in general. Okay, and it becomes a major feature of Methodism, of Baptist theology, and many other evangelical forms of Christianity from there on. So the Second Great Awakening actually begins around 1800. Okay, right around the time that we get into the first iterations of the Industrial Revolution, where the country is beginning to expand a little bit more, and it begins to magnify more and more the popularity of these evangelist denominations, right? Primarily the Baptists, the Methodists, and the Presbyterians, okay? And emphasizes the idea of universal salvation, right? That we need to try to convert everybody to Christianity in order to save their souls. And it has two distinct phases. We have one that begins in the north, right, involves most of the elite New England colleges, and ends up spreading into the former middle colonies like New York and Pennsylvania, and finally filtering into the Midwest around Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. And the rural phase ends up spreading a little bit more into the South, okay, the backwoods of Tennessee, Kentucky, and this is where we start to really see it take off in the more emotional and fundamentalist aspects, okay. And this is the brand or the form of Baptist and Methodist forms of Christianity that eventually end up filtering more and more into the South and what we recognize specifically in the South today. Now, as for the denominations themselves, we'll go through a few brief characteristics of each one here. The Presbyterian Church, for one, is actually not a religion or a denomination that begins in the United States. It actually begins in the United Kingdom, specifically in Scotland. Okay? And it's linked back to Scots-Irish immigrants who actually began to practice this around the same time that we see the English Civil War. Okay, so going back the better part of 150 years or even a little bit further than that. Okay, once we start to see Charles I attempt to convert everyone in the United Kingdom to Anglicanism, a lot of the Presbyterians end up leaving Scotland for Ireland and eventually going to the New World, which eventually becomes America, of course. And so we see more and more Scots-Irish immigrants who are importing Presbyterianism to the United States during this time, and they primarily land around Pennsylvania and Georgia, okay, so along that stretch of the eastern seaboard. One primary religious leader of this movement is Charles Finney. Okay, he's a Presbyterian minister who has a large celebrity status during this point in time, right, from about 1830 to 1831. And he, in particular, preaches a democratic gospel, saying that anyone has the right to choose salvation. Okay, so in other words, it's a big departure from the largely Calvinist principles that Presbyterianism was originally founded upon. So this is a little bit of a breakaway from that idea of predestination. And of course, the alternative choice for salvation is eternal damnation. Okay, and that's one big feature of the Second Great Awakening is the use of evangelical Christianity in some ways, not always, but in some ways, as a way to scare people into salvation. Right, the idea that if you do not choose salvation, then the alternative is pretty horrible. Now, the Congregationalists are another group we've already discussed very briefly. They've been in America for quite a while now. Okay, they're very similar to what we've seen with the Puritans. Their name comes from the idea that the congregation is the one that makes democratic decisions about the future of the church. Okay, and they tend to be a bit more fundamentalist in their ideas. When it comes to the separation of church and state in America, going back to Thomas Jefferson very briefly here, he received a letter at one point from the Baptists of Danbury, Connecticut, claiming that that they were being persecuted by another neighboring religious community, and he had to assure them that there will forever be a wall of separation between the church and the state, and that Connecticut is not going to, adhere to this other group's ideologies in an exclusive state-sponsored way. Okay, and that group was a Congregationalist group. Okay, so even still at this point in time, there are religious denominations that are constantly at war with one another over their ideologies, right? They don't necessarily agree to coexist in all manners. And again, the Congregationalists are very similar even in some regards to this new form of Presbyterianism, okay, when it comes to matters of theology in particular, okay. And so in some cases, Presbyterians and Congregationalists are so similar that they end up forming these kind of sister churches with one another, in some cases even combining congregations into what we call Presbygational churches. Now, the Baptists, of course, become one of the more prominent ones, especially here in the South. Okay, they end up dominating the frontier revival scene. Okay, they end up appealing to individuals who have been living on the fringes of society for quite a while. Okay, and there's multiple factions of the Baptist Church. Okay, multiple forms that it ends up taking, multiple degrees of fundamentalism. Okay. And biblical fundamentalism tends to be kind of the cornerstone for Baptist theology. Okay, the idea, again, that all events that took place in the Christian Bible were literal fact. Okay, that all the events actually happened exactly the way they did. And the idea here for salvation is that it's available through adult baptism. Okay, the idea that you will actually submerge an individual in the water, and the water symbolically, and in some cases in a transmutation of sorts, ends up literally washing away all of their previous sins, original sins, and when you bring them back up out of the water, they are cleansed. Okay. And they also stress the idea of social equality before God. And this is where the Baptist theology ends up splitting into a couple of different factions, okay? Because once baptism begins to filter down into the South especially, it comes at odds with slavery. Okay, so there is a form of Baptist theology that says that people should be socially equal, and one that actually adopts slavery, and in some cases even goes so far as to claim that God himself is white. And of course, Methodist ideology is similar in some regards to the Baptist theology, but differs in matters of a few fundamental aspects along with ritual and so forth. It still shares the idea in free will to convert, okay? But again, the alternative to free will to convert or not is, of course, eternal damnation, okay? So this is still used as somewhat of a scare tactic by most of the denominations that you see here, at least at some point. And the Methodist Church is the one to actually develop the idea of a circuit rider form of evangelism via horseback. Okay, so you actually have a traveling minister now who might go from town to town and even from church to church, and might even preach in a church that is not necessarily part of their own denomination. Okay, so this is a big feature, especially among televangelists today, individuals who actually own, their own private jets and have large churches and so forth, right? You see these types of things occurring where people will go on speaking engagements and that sort of thing, and it all originates back to the Second Great Awakening. One particular minister who does this in an early form is a man named Peter Cartwright. He's a minister who actually goes so far as to preach 3 hours every single day for 20 years. Okay, so this is a man who's extremely dedicated to his faith and to the cause. Now, among some of the more mainstream Christian denominations that emerged during the early part of the 19th century, one that stands out among all the others is the Mormon Church, okay, better known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And the history of the Mormon Church is actually very, very different and involves a lot of intrigue and a lot of drama compared to some of the others. Okay, it's founded in 1823 by Joseph Smith, okay, a native New Yorker. And Joseph Smith claims at this point in time, in 1823, that he has received a vision, okay, to travel into a certain area of upstate New York, where he actually encounters an angel, okay, and this angel, named Moroni, if I'm not mistaken, tells him to dig in a certain spot in the ground, from which he unearths a lost gospel, okay, which you see here in a facsimile form, okay. It's believed to be kind of this large, almost 3-ring binder type item, and this document is written on gold tablets. Okay, it's a treasure in and of itself if it actually existed. And in this particular document is told kind of this lost history of of North America, okay, and of the interaction between the Middle East and the birthplace of Christianity with North America. And the whole idea here in this particular story is that a group of Israelites that he refers to as the Nephites supposedly sailed to America approximately 2,100 years before Columbus makes it to the Americas. And they end up falling into a pattern of wickedness over time, okay? Not too dissimilar to what we end up seeing with a lot of Old Testament stories about cities like Sodom and Gomorrah and things like that. And ultimately, over time, the Nephites are destroyed by another group referred to as the Lamanites. These are allegedly the ancestors of Native Americans. Okay? And the Nephites are destroyed by the Lamanites sometime around 385 CE, okay, the Common Era, sometimes called AD. Now, Smith is somehow able to translate these gold plates from what he refers to as Reformed Egyptian using 2 magical stones that he alleges to have found as well. Okay, and he's only able to translate these in secret. No one is allowed to watch him or see his face while he does this translation. Okay, and these stones, if I'm not mistaken, are alleged to have come from the breastplate of a Nephite ceremonial garb. Okay, in Old Testament stories, the priests of Judaism, in many cases, would be decorated with this large ceremonial breastplate in which multiple stones of different colors would have been embedded. Okay, and these stones eventually, over time, somehow found their way into this alleged archaeological site in upstate New York, and Joseph Smith claims to have harnessed some kind of power through these to allow him to translate this. It's worth noting, too, that by all historical records, Joseph Smith was illiterate. Okay, and so his only way to really be able to transcribe all this is to basically set up a situation where he allegedly sat on one side of a curtain of sorts, okay, with the stones and the tablets, and on the other side of the curtain he had someone who was literate, who was actually listening to him dictate what he was translating. Okay. Now, in 1826, the veil on some of this ends up getting lifted a bit, okay? And take from this what you will in terms of belief. I make no claims one way or the other about the legitimacy of this, but in 1826, Joseph Smith is actually convicted of being a, quote, disorderly man and an impostor by a New York court, okay? He actually ends up pleading guilty to defrauding several citizens when it comes to gold digging expeditions, okay? That he was actually taking money from them, leading them into the wilderness to search for other treasures of sorts in this same area, and somehow knowing that perhaps there was nothing buried there. Okay, and he also claimed to possess quote-unquote dark necromantic powers. Okay, now necromancy is the idea of being able to summon and speak to the dead. Okay, so he claimed to possess some kind of dark magical powers here. 4 years later, after this all occurs, Smith actually convinces his neighbor, a man named Martin Harris, to mortgage his entire farm in order to pay for the publication of this newly transcribed 500-page book that he refers to as the Book of Mormon. Okay, and Joseph Smith actually had to transcribe the Book of Mormon twice. Okay, in the first case, I can't remember if it was his wife or Martin Harris's wife who found out about this and actually destroyed the original documents, burned them, because the wife, whichever wife it was, believed that this was blasphemous, that this was some kind of scam of some sort. And so it ends up being retranscribed by Martin Harris in this particular form. Okay. And examining most of the passages of the Book of Mormon, many people have come to the conclusion that a lot of these are reproductions from the Christian Bible. Okay, that many of the phraseology, the terms, and even passages are taken word for word from some of the books from both the Old and the New Testament. And ultimately, Smith is responsible for founding what he refers to as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is sometimes now referred to as the Mormon Church, okay? Or, in short, the LDS Church, okay? Which is what its followers choose to refer to it as. And the theology of the Mormon Church is somewhat bizarre in comparison to a lot of the other Christian denominations of the time. It makes claims that no other denomination attempts to pursue. Okay. For one thing, Smith claims that God, angels, and humans are all actually members of the same quote-unquote species. Okay. That we are actually related in a fundamental way to God and to angels. He also criticizes the sins of the wealthy in particular. Okay, so this becomes a little bit more of a middle class and even in some cases a working class type religion. Okay, one that is designated specifically for that audience. He preaches universal salvation, which again is pretty common for the time, and also denies the existence of hell. Okay, so again, this ends up taking a little bit piecemeal, it seems, from some of the other major denominations of the time. And he goes so far as to encourage his followers to abandon alcohol, to abandon tobacco, and caffeine, right? So essentially any mind-altering substances of any kind, right? Anything that could potentially be intoxicating or potentially addiction forming. Okay? And he tells them to do this in preparation for the second coming of Christ. Okay? So he believes that, like many others at the time, that we are, hurtling toward the end of days. Okay? That somehow the second coming is imminent, and that once Christ returns, then all of humanity will be judged based on one standard or another. One of the most controversial aspects of the Mormon Church, and something that doesn't get resolved really until the middle part of the 20th century, and really the later part, frankly, is that Joseph Smith and many of his descendants disallow men and women of African descent to gain the status of priest. Okay? Many young men in the Mormon Church are put through a particular process once they come of age, where they are supposed to spend a certain amount of time studying and basically apprenticing how to become a priest in the church. Okay? They go into a missionary type situation, right, where they are actually assigned to perhaps a specific city or a specific neighborhood or something like that, in modern form anyway. And they're supposed to stay in this particular region and minister to people for a certain amount of time before they can come back home. Okay? And people of African descent are not granted this particular right in the church. Moreover, anyone, whether it's a man or a woman, they're not allowed temple admittance either. Okay, so if you want to go into a Mormon temple, take part in the rituals and so forth, if you are of African descent, you are excluded from this. Okay? And so this becomes a big issue going, especially all the way into the 20th century. It's not until 1978 that this is actually resolved, and it's due to the actions of the NAACP to actually intervene here and allow individuals to take part in this. And the excuse that's given by Joseph Smith and by his successor Brigham Young is very similar to what we've seen given as an excuse for why slavery is allowed to continue. Okay? The idea of an Old Testament biblical curse of some kind, that somehow individuals of African descent are descendants of Cain or descendants of Ham, one of the sons of Noah. It's a very involved and very fictitious form of reasoning. Okay, and so it doesn't fully get resolved until 1978, when the church actually begins to come to its senses a bit. Now, in the aftermath of all of this, okay, Mormons very quickly gain a negative reputation among other Christian denominations in the region of upstate New York because their rituals are extremely secretive. Okay, even today, admittance into Mormon temples tends to be extremely exclusive. They tend to be very clannish when it comes to actually participating in their community. And they, in many cases, refuse to obey local laws as well. Okay, they claim to have to answer to God and to the Mormon Church above the U.S. Constitution and above temporal laws. And Smith ultimately begins to deny the legitimacy of civil governments and the U.S. Constitution at large. Okay, and this is what causes people over time to begin to look at the Mormon Church with more and more dissatisfaction. And it causes the Mormons to end up packing up from New York State, moving to Ohio initially, and then again moving to Missouri. Okay? Once they get to Missouri, however, the governor himself ends up driving them out of the state. Okay? It's not until 1839 that Smith and his company finally land in Commerce, Illinois, which they renamed Nauvoo. Okay? This is a term that means beautiful land. In 1844, Smith becomes the de facto mayor and ruler, really, of Nauvoo. Okay, he is both a religious leader and a temporal leader. Okay, and he ends up running essentially a monopoly on the community. He owns the general store, the hotel, the newspaper. He is the mayor, the chief justice, and commander of a 2,000-man army, and is a church trustee. Okay, so he gains a lot of authority in this small area. And he becomes extremely unpopular with his followers in the meantime. He ends up excommunicating those who are dissidents, okay, kicks them completely out of the community, and also practices polygamy, one of the major stereotypical features of the Mormon Church. Okay? He, at one point, has over 24 wives. And at one point, despite the fact that he has already disavowed the U.S. Constitution and civil governments, claims that he wants to run for President of the United States. Now, Smith's fate is finally sealed on June 27th of 1844, when he and his brother Hiram are actually arrested by the community for claiming they actually enact some sort of a mutiny here, because they believe that he has grown far too powerful for his, for who he actually is as a human being. He at one point actually attempts to shut down the newspaper because they begin publishing articles against him. And so he and his brother are arrested and put in a local prison. Immediately after that, though, a mob of about 200 people attempt to break into the prison and lynch Hiram and Joseph Smith. Okay? Hiram is shot in the face and is killed almost immediately, and Joseph Smith is actually shot multiple times attempting to flee the jail, falls from a second-story window, and dies. Okay, so Joseph Smith meets with a very, very bitter end for a religious leader especially. Now his successor is Brigham Young, okay, a man who is elected to succeed him as the leader of the Latter-day Saints Church. And Brigham Young decides he's going to wipe the slate clean and start over. Okay, so he moves the entire congregation of Mormon followers to the Great Salt Lake in Utah in 1847. Okay, this is where the Mormon Church in America still has its headquarters today. In 1848, they establish an independent state and governorship, which they refer to as Deseret. Okay, this is another term that is supposed to mean the land of the honeybee. And Brigham Young ends up doubling down on many of the types of theology and temporal-based rules in the Mormon Church that his predecessor did. Okay, and he ends up ruling the church for more than 20 years with what some would call an iron fist. Okay, he's very much a fundamentalist, is very no nonsense, and Brigham Young University in Salt Lake City, Utah, is named for him today. Utah, meanwhile, is not actually admitted as an official state in the Union until 1896 because the Mormons, up until that point, refused to disavow polygamy. Now, something that ends up filtering out of religion in some regards and into the literary and social movements here is something called Transcendentalism. Okay, and this is born out of the greater literary movement, artistic movement, really, of Romanticism. Okay, it has to do with artistic expression of some kind that idealizes nature, that idealizes human beings, is supposed to incorporate emotion very, very heavily. And so Transcendentalism and Romanticism are kind of another more secular foil to Enlightenment era ideologies. Okay, so it kind of moves away from reason and rationality and more into again, the idea of transcendentalism, the term itself, is that humanity is able to transcend this temporal world into a spiritual one through artistic expression. And so this is, again, coming around the same time as the Second Great Awakening, okay, very early 19th century. And it's, again, a rebellion against the ideas of logic and reason and science, and ends up embracing the spiritual and the supernatural in one form or another. A lot of nonconformity ends up coming into play here, because so this is an early modern form of almost a counterculture movement, if you like. Okay, it's something that again ends up preceding the counterculture movement that we see of the 1960s, again by about 160 years. Okay, but very, very similar in many regards. Okay, so nonconformity, spontaneity, creativity, and mysticism. Okay, people begin to get involved in religions and traditions that have been outmoded or have been suppressed in many cases even by the church. Okay, so a lot of the classical pagan ideologies, depictions of classical gods, of the worship of nature, the presence of fairies and angels and these types of things end up coming more back into the forefront again. Okay, people begin to embrace folklore. They begin to, depict different mythological figures and paintings. They begin to write more about them. And it tends to reject organized religion more so than anything else, and rationalism, right, in favor of some sort of middle passage here, some sort of middle road that tends to be a bit more pantheistic than anything else. Okay, pantheism is an idea where basically God or the divine exists in everything around us, right? In all of nature, God or the divine, however you would like to imagine it, can be found in trees, in streams, in clouds, in animals, and so forth. Okay, sort of an animistic ideology as well. Okay, but something that permeates. So the earth itself is alive, is what it amounts to. And it tends to be, the spearheading of this tends to be granted to Ralph Waldo Emerson. Okay, he's a poet and a philosopher who becomes very, very famous during this time. He believes that humans have the ability to create a spiritual harmony with nature and are in some ways going to be allowed to tap into a divine spark of creation by doing so. Okay, so it's kind of a return back to this sort of bucolic countryside idea. Okay, so again, it tends to kind of marry very closely with what we've already seen with something like what Jefferson viewed for republicanism. Okay, we look at it in a political sense. Okay, this idea of people being, gentlemen farmers, living off the land, living in harmony with nature, and so forth. And again, this is part of where some of these more classical forms of religion, and again, classical paganism in some regards comes into play, right? The idea that the gods are present in nature in some form or another. And the book Nature, that's written by Emerson in 1836, ends up launching the Transcendentalist movement by adopting this idea of a pantheistic ideology. And the Transcendental Club ends up forming over time, meets in Boston and Concord, and it's a group of like-minded artists, writers, social philosophers, in some cases politicians, who discuss philosophy, religion, literature, you name it. Okay? And it's not necessarily designated to one specific class of people. You might have liberal clergymen who take part in it. You might have utopian reformers who want to see society gravitate into a new evolution of how it's supposed to exist. You might have abolitionists who want to do away with slavery, writers, of course, early feminists, right? There's all kinds of progressive social movements that tend to gravitate toward transcendentalism. And one of the more famous individuals involved in this is Henry David Thoreau. Okay, Thoreau becomes a very interesting figure during this point because he's actually a bit of a hermit. Okay, and he is something of a polymath himself. Okay, he's an expert in several areas. Okay, not only is he a writer, but he's also an expert in carpentry, masonry, painting, surveying, sailing, gardening, woodworking. Right, he knows everything about how to exist off the land, how to be self-sustaining. And again, he becomes kind of a hermit because he ends up moving away from society, okay, and living in nature. Okay? And the book that he is most well known for, of course, is the book called Walden. Okay? It's written about a 2-year period that he lives in the woods near Walden Pond, okay, and experiences nature firsthand and so forth. Okay? So very much embodies the idea of transcendentalism. And he also writes an essay in 1849 called Civil Disobedience, in which he actually takes a much more political stance. Okay, he says that we need to be opposed to injustice as human beings. Parenthetically, he was also directly opposed to taxation, okay, and actually got a little bit in trouble at one point for refusing to pay taxes. Now, the last bit we'll talk about here in this first half are some of the major literary figures from this time period, because this is really the golden age of American literature, right? A lot of major recognizable figures emerged during this period. Nathaniel Hawthorne is arguably one of the more famous. Okay? He's actually a native of Salem, Massachusetts, right, where the Salem witch trials took place. And most of his stories tend to examine the darker nature of humanity and sin. Okay, so stories that we have from him include the Scarlet Letter, okay, which actually looks at how humanity tends to ostracize human beings. Okay, and Scarlet Letter specifically deals with a young woman who's been accused of adultery. Okay, and she actually has to wear a scarlet letter A on her clothing to publicly identify her in a shameful way as an adulteress. Okay, and it's an examination of how society ends up looking at her, how they treat her, and so forth. And The House of the Seven Gables is another one that is engages in some very dark thematic material. Emily Dickinson is another individual, right? She ends up living as a lifelong shut-in her home. Okay, she ends up writing several poems that most of which are actually not published until after her death. And her poems, again, engage in some very dark, thematic, human experience here. Okay, everything from death, fear, loneliness, depression, the absence of God, and so she ends up living in relative isolation, and I think is only able to publish a few poems during her life under a pseudonym, and she actually, I believe, has to use a male pseudonym in order to do this. One of her most famous poems, of course, is "Because I Could Not Stop for Death." Okay, and the line goes, "Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me." Edgar Allan Poe is arguably one of the most, if not the most famous 19th century literary figure in American literature. Okay? He is, of course, well known for having these extremely dark and macabre stories that deal with everything from murder to curses, very gothic, heavily gothic literature, including The Fall of the House of Usher, which deals with generational curses, The Mask of the Red Death, which of course deals with disease, medievalism, and The Raven, which deals with messages from the beyond, okay, and the death of a long-lost lover. Herman Melville is another individual here. He's a former sailor, and his writings typically are thematic when it comes to the sea. Okay? He's most well known for writing Moby Dick, right? The major epic about the giant white whale and the sea captain Ahab, who actually becomes so obsessed with destroying this monster because it ended up taking his leg at one point. And Walt Whitman is another individual, famous for very different reasons. He is very open in his embrace of nonconformity. Okay? Whitman actually grew a very long beard, wore kind of outlandish clothing, a tall, wide-brimmed hat, and was seen kind of rambling around nature, very much like a stereotypical wizard appearance. Okay? And he gains a lot of controversy during his lifetime, and in still some cases even today, for the fact that his poetry contains a lot of homoerotic overtones. Walt Whitman was gay during a time when it was actually considered illegal to be gay in American culture. And his most famous work is Leaves of Grass. He writes several poems that engage in pantheistic views, views about what happens to humans after death, the idea that we return to the earth, right? I believe some of the lines include something along the lines of, if you look for me once I'm gone, you have only to look under your feet. Basically, I am in every cloud, I am under every leaf of grass, and that sort of thing.